Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy's June 2022 session. For our regular followers, welcome back. For those of you who are new to these meetings, welcome. We're glad to have you with us. The NFRPP is a nonpartisan educational network that provides a platform for experts to discuss important public policy issues. And if you like what you hear, please register for our mailing list. You can go to our website at nfrpp.org. The topic for this evening is America's vulnerable elections. Although we think that all of NFRPP's topics are important, this one has a claim to being among the more important topics that we've covered. Elections are at the core of what defines America. As far back as the Declaration of Independence, we see written that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is, we get to choose those who govern us. Another interesting way we can see how Americans feel about elections is by thinking about how often we use the word unelected. Unelected judges making law, or unelected bureaucrats creating regulations. The word is very often used pejoratively. On the other hand, when we talk about elected officials, it's usually with a sense of expectation or service. It's time for our elected officials in DC to do this or that. So with elections being so important, you'd think we'd have a good handle on how to run them. Seems simple enough. People run for office, vote for them, we count the votes, the winner gets to govern. But as soon as you think about any of those steps in detail, you can see how none of that's obvious. Who gets to run? Who gets to vote? How do we count? Is the person with the most votes the correct winner? Should they be? Throughout its history, the US has struggled with all of these. So tonight we have with us a group who can talk about these issues and more. Moderating our discussion is Pam Fessler, and I'll leave it to Pam to introduce the panel. Pam was an editor and correspondent at NPR News for more than 28 years. As a correspondent on the national desk, she covered voting issues, poverty, philanthropy. For most of her time at NPR, Pam reported on elections and voting, including efforts to make voting more accessible, accurate, and secure. She did countless stories on everything from the debate over state voter laws to the Russian hacking attempts and the impact of misinformation. And her reporting was recognized with the 2011 First Place National Headliner Award. Before we start, I'm just going to mention some logistics. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. So please type your questions into that tab at any time during the presentation. There's no need to wait. We'll monitor the questions throughout and forward them on to the moderator. And with that, let me turn the evening over to Pam Fessler.
Thank you, Lee. I really appreciate it. I am very excited to be here. I think anybody who watched today's January 6th committee hearing realizes just how crucial an issue and how timely this discussion is. We saw these hearings today and also the earlier ones, so much evidence of the extraordinary efforts that were made by Trump and his allies to overturn the 2020 election. And today a lot about the pressure that Vice President Mike Pence was under to block the counting of electoral votes. But that wasn't the only thing that happened this week that just showed what a serious political and electoral crisis this country faces. First of all, we also heard testimony from retired Judge Michael Aludic, who said that this is not just something that happened in 2020, but this is a threat that we continue to face and will face in 2024, because he said that he believes that Trump and his supporters continue to pose a clear and present danger to American democracy, because they're already setting the stage to overturn the 2024 election if it does not go their way. And indeed, this week we saw the election in Nevada of a prominent election denier, Jim Marchant, as the Republican nominee for Secretary of State. It's a job in which he will oversee, if he is elected, the elections in that state. And he is one of dozens of candidates who have already been nominated for positions in state jobs that will oversee elections, who are election deniers. And also this week, a lot of people probably didn't notice this, but in Otero County, New Mexico, we had a county commission that has refused to certify the primary results of their voters in the county, because not for any specific reason other than that they don't trust the process. All of these things together are just examples of some of the vulnerabilities we face. And so we couldn't really have a better panel to discuss these issues. We are going to be talking mostly about structural problems with our election system today, and we have three wonderful speakers: Larry Jacobs, Ned Foley, and Kevin Johnson. And I'm going to introduce them as we go along, because I want to start out with asking each of our panelists just to take maybe 5 to 10 minutes and talk about what you see as maybe the most crucial vulnerability to our electoral system right now, and why you think it is such a vulnerability. And I'd like to start with Larry. Larry is the McKnight President. He's got one of the longest titles: McKnight Presidential Chair in Public Affairs, the Walter F. and Joan Mondale Chair for Political Studies, and the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the Hubert H. Humphrey School in the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. And Larry has written and edited 17 books and dozens of articles on elections, legislative and presidential politics, and public opinion. And his newest book is called, appropriately, Democracy Under Fire: Donald Trump and the Breaking of American History, in which he lays out the pernicious effect of primary elections and how they are undermining rather than boosting our democracy. So Larry, maybe you could take it away and talk a little bit about what you see right now as the main structural vulnerability we have in our electoral system.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank the organizers of tonight, and thank you, Pam. You have been one of the really important leaders in a lot of these conversations and providing robust reporting to get information out to folks. Tonight, we're going to talk a lot about the rules of the game, the threats to those rules, the bending of those rules, the outright violations of democratic norms and laws. I want to go a step back, and I want to look at where did those rules come from? What is their origins? And really focus on the direct primary, which is how we nominate candidates at the state and national level. This is the nomination process really all over the world is done by political parties. It's the party leaders and the folks who are members. In the United States, we have stripped those groups of that power, and it's the folks who turn out for caucuses and especially primary elections who decide who's going to be the nominee. And there's several really, I think, quite significant detrimental developments that have occurred over the last half century. One of which is that the voices that are involved in selecting nominees is incredibly narrow and unrepresentative of the country. A typical presidential election, you have about a quarter or a third of Democrats and Republicans who turn out. Midterm elections like this year, it's about half that. When AOC knocked off a prominent Democratic leader in Queens, her turnout was 12%. And that was a very important election. And you can see the significance of it in terms of her positioning. And, you know, the second part of this is that the voices that are turning out, it's not only small, but they're quite unrepresentative of Democrats and Republicans in the country. They tend to be fairly extreme in terms of their policy preferences or ideologies in the Democratic and especially the Republican Party. And one way to see that is looking at the nomination of Donald Trump. When he announced in 2015 his candidacy for the nomination of the Republican Party, virtually every major Republican leader came out and said he was unfit. And watching the January 6th hearings and the reports by the top administration officials, these are not Democrats, these are, you know, the president's chief of staff and the vice president's chief of staff and the attorney general. What they're reporting is in the ballpark of what was anticipated as Donald Trump's character and his disregard for the constitutional law. Not a surprise. So how is it that Donald Trump was nominated, despite all that was anticipated accurately? And the answer to that question is that Donald Trump, in a crowded field, was able to mobilize a fairly extreme select group of primary voters who turned out and allowed him to win again and again, enough to push him over the top. But we also see this effect in terms of the policies that are adopted by folks who, once they are nominated and elected. In February 2021, when the, in January of 2020, when the, no, I had that right. When the votes were being counted, you had 70% of Republicans in the House come out and refuse to certify the results. Why would they do that? And we know behind the scenes that a lot of them were saying, yeah, they knew that Biden won, but they did it because they knew if they defied Donald Trump, they would be facing what Liz Cheney is facing now, which is a fiery primary challenger and the possibility of being defeated. So this process has really taken the power away from party leaders who would be looking for candidates who could win majorities and follow the law and the Constitution. It's let in renegades, and Donald Trump was one, but as Pam said, we are seeing this year dozens of candidates who are now being nominated for governor and secretary of state and attorney general around the country who no longer subscribe to the rule of law with regards to elections. They are ready to insert their own preferences. This is an extraordinary development that we don't see in other countries. Now, one response might be, wait a second, what's wrong with voters deciding who the nominee is going to be? Nothing's wrong with that. It's great if voters turned out, but we're finding in practice tiny and unrepresentative. And once those folks are nominated, they're nominating, then a whole nother process kicks in that is virtually assuring in many cases that their nominee is going to win the support of certainly their party, in some cases, majority of voters. We have about 90% of congressional elections that are safe, meaning whoever is nominated by the party will be elected because each party's partisans will rally around the headliner. Well, that means that the power over much of the majority in Congress rests with about 10% of voters who are turning out for congressional elections. And a similar story in 2016, where Donald Trump, once he won the nomination, he had over 90% of Republicans rallying around him, as occurred in 2020, not because they thought he was a outstanding individual or had notable characteristics suitable to being president. No, the polls suggested many didn't, but because America is divided into teams. And once you get to the general election, you vote for your team. And so direct primaries are a significant threat to our country. And it's something I think we really need to dig in on and change. And we can do that.
And just real quickly, this has not been the case for that many years, right?
It's only been the case since 1972. And it's interesting, the history of this goes back about 100 years. And back in the 1920s, there was a whole group of progressive reformers who opposed the primaries. Why? Because they said it let in corrupt factions, because it tended to elect demagogues who are great at stirring up a crowd, often with falsehoods. Sound familiar?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Larry. And of course, that is one very major aspect or vulnerability in our current system. And I wanted to move on next to Ned, who I would say, Ned, are you're if you're not the expert in the country on the Electoral Account Act of 1887, you are certainly one of a very small group of people who is an expert on this. Ned is holds the Ebersold Chair in Constitutional Law at the Ohio State University, where he directs the election law program. He's a contributing opinion columnist for the Washington Post and does quite a few, quite frankly. And for the 2020 election season, he served as an NBC News election analyst. His most recent book is Presidential Elections and Majority Rule. And in that book, you explore the philosophical premises of how the Electoral College is supposed to work and how laws today might be reformed to enable that Electoral College to operate according to those original objectives of the of the Electoral College. And we're hearing so much about the Electoral College and its role in the 2020 election, especially. So maybe you could start and talk a little bit about what you see, why you see that as a vulnerability.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. And I want to echo what Larry said about just, it's been great to know you, and you've been such a public service to our country and to our citizens in terms of informing us about how elections work. So we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to you. So thank you. So the Electoral Account Act, yeah, it was very, it was sort of a sleepy tributary of election law for a while. Not many people wanted to spend time with it because it's such a monstrosity in terms of convoluted verbiage from the 19th century. But it was a product of our first huge presidential crisis, which was the 1876 election that did get referenced in today's hearings for folks who watched it. And it's because the Constitution itself, has this electoral college system, which is, pretty sparsely explained in the Constitution and needs laws to implement it. And there's really two aspects of the vulnerabilities that system creates. One involves the counting of votes, which is, I think, top of mind at the moment for anybody who's watched the hearings, and as you mentioned the New Mexico example of the commission refusing to honor results and this concept of election denialism. So I think I'll mention that vulnerability first, and then I'll come back to the other vulnerability, which is maybe even more structural, which was the point of the book that you mentioned, and I think does tie in quite effectively with what Larry was talking about, primaries, because ultimately elections are about lots of candidates wanting to run for office. Only one can win. So how do you winnow the field? I mean, this Alaska special election that Sarah Palin is involved in, many people may know that until earlier this week, there were 48 candidates, got winnowed to 4, but only one can hold the office. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of the danger that Judge Ludick talked about, which I completely agree with him that we unfortunately currently face. And really this danger, based on my research, we really have not ever faced before, is the willful refusal of one party and its candidates to accept defeat when the verdict of the voters is that they want the other side to hold office for the next term. The concept of an electoral democracy is that it's competitive, winners have a term, and then the voters get to vote again. And so nothing is permanent, but no one is entitled to hold office without that imprimatur of the voters' assent. And what is so troubling and dangerous is that fundamental premise was attacked by President Trump. I think the hearings make that undeniable. And as Judge Ludick said, that was not a one-time event. There is sort of a systematic ethos, unfortunately, among some parts of our political process, that kind of repudiation of the will of the voters, if you don't like the result, is part of the game. It's just, it is a form of the competition, but it should be out of bounds. There's proper competition and improper competition. So some of this is just morality and civics and having at least a sufficient degree of virtue among our public candidates and office holders to accept the premises of the system as a whole. But the insight from our founders, including Madison, was that you want to design a constitutional republic that has institutional arrangements that recognizes that people are not angels, that virtue is not 100%. We're all human beings. And so while we need a sufficient amount of virtue to make the system work, what are the right institutions that can deal with us as ordinary folks? And for that, I think we definitely need, several sets of reforms, but this Electoral Account Act is one of them, because in its current form, it's an invitation to abuse. to partisan power grabbing and greed. That's true at different levels of the system. What happened in 2020 really was that, again, all the state and local officials, from Brad Raffensperger to folks in Michigan and elsewhere in the legislature and administrative bodies, when Trump implored that they do the wrong thing, they refused. Now, Trump is trying to replace those officials with more compliant ones. But the real danger, in my judgment, of what 2020 showed and what could be replicated again in 24 is members of Congress willing to abuse their role in the system. You had both senators and representatives. Larry alluded to the number of House members who signed on to this idea of an objection, which was completely inappropriate for any of them to sign on, because there was no valid basis to object in the first place. We know that from Attorney General Barr and Trump's own campaign officials, and yet they were willing to abuse the process anyway. Under the Constitution, Congress, again, will be the official body to accept and declare the outcome. And so that process has to depend on Congress's willingness to accept the limits of its role. And people who are determined to abuse power at all costs cannot probably be constrained by written rules. Maybe they can be constrained by court orders. And one good piece of news out of New Mexico was after the county commission refused to certify the result, the New Mexico Supreme Court ordered them to do so. And I haven't heard the latest result of whether they're going to comply with that judicial order, but at least the courts are standing up for the rule of law. But it's a fraught proposition of whether, if Congress abuses its power under the Constitution, whether the Supreme Court would feel comfortable ordering Congress to do something. That topic actually came up in the hearing again about the so-called political question doctrine and the role of the courts. But we maximize the likelihood that members of Congress will obey the law if they understand it and they wrote it themselves and they embrace it. So that's why we need a moment right now where the Senate is working on a bipartisan bill that will improve the Electoral Account Act, will change it from old-fashioned 19th century language that's hard to follow to hopefully more direct, comprehensible, accessible, transparent language that we all can understand, that the members understand, that they write themselves. And then, having adopted it, essentially now, they don't attempt to repudiate it next time on January 6, 2025. Right. So I think that's the highest structural priority in order to maximize the likelihood that our votes will get counted authentically and respected. And just very briefly to allude to the other point that we could come back to, as much as I completely agree with Larry that we have to reform the primary process because it's not operating the way as intended and it's really causing extreme problems, we have to think about the way that primaries interact with the rules of the November general election, because again, both are part of this winnowing process. And we use, for the most part in the United States, something called plurality winner elections. Now that's a term that some people may know, others may not, but it basically means the only thing that matters is you get more votes than anybody else, but it doesn't have to be a majority. Now, if there are only two candidates, the most is a majority, and in the expectation of a two-party system, plurality and majority means the same thing. But by constitutional rights, third parties, independents can run, and the plurality winner rules, for reasons we can go into, kind of really messes up the system. And it did, that was the point of the book that you mentioned. It turns out, yes, Trump divided and conquered the Republican Party in the primary process, but he did not win a majority of votes in November in the states that put him over the top for the Electoral College. Right. Gary Johnson was a third party candidate, Jill Stein, another candidate. And if you look at the key states, Trump was under 50% in the states that made him the winner. And we have to pay attention to that also.
Thank you, Ned, very much. And I do want to explore, I want to first let Kevin have a chance to talk, but I do very much want to explore the distinction between making structural changes and then the people who fill that structure, and where, you know, what do you do to make sure that those people follow those rules? So Kevin, I think, comes at this a slightly different angle. Kevin is the co-founder and executive director of the Election Reformers Network, and he leads ERN's research and advocacy programs focused on impartial election administration, independent redistricting, ranked choice voting, and also electoral college reform. He has more than 20 years of experience in election reform, including 7 years overseas with the National Democratic Institute and 10 years on the Board of Common Cause in Massachusetts. He's also a member of the Election Expert Study Team at the Carter Center, and he co-authored the first comprehensive study of Secretary of State conflict of interest. So Kevin, what do you see as the main vulnerability, or one of the main? I know there's so many. But
there's no shortage of vulnerabilities, that is for sure.
No shortage, yes.
There's also the vulnerability that your mic is muted and you start talking and no one can hear you. But fortunately, I quickly responded to that one. Let me first say, you know, a hats off to Lee and to Rhoda for this organization that you folks run. You know, the Network for Responsible Public Policy, just looking through it, you guys have wrestled with a lot of great topics. So it is an honor to be here. And I'll confess that I've all three of you I'm just big fans of, but I have Ned Foley's Ballot Battles book literally on my bedside table. And it's one of the best, you know, I recommend it to everyone. It's just a great discussion of how this country has wrestled with disputed elections. And it's an interesting, you know what, I come at all of this from the experience of working overseas, you know, monitoring elections, helping new democracies, and you know, disputed elections, that's the measure of an election system. Is the system in place to handle the dispute when it comes? And we don't quite have that frame of mind here. We sort of think of disputed elections as like the hurricane that maybe comes, like the 100-year flood, but you build a system ready to handle it, which was something that we were really a part of overseas. So we definitely have to gear that up. But I'm jumping ahead. Let me back up a second. Election Reformers Network was founded by a group of people who all had this experience in places like the post-Berlin Wall of Central and Eastern Europe and the Nelson Mandela South Africa, of helping countries that were kind of starting from scratch. And for an American, it was a fascinating experience, because what the folks in those countries need to know from that position is not how Americans do it. That would be criminal negligence to recommend what we do, or at least parts of what we do. But instead, what's the range? What are the options? What's on the menu? How do different systems work? What's a parliamentary system? What outcome does that lead to? If we, instead of having single member districts, we have multi-member districts, which addresses some of the issues Ned and Larry have talked about. Who should run elections? Is there some way to get more independent people? So we as a team became immersed in the variety of democracy and democratic institutions. And then starting in 2017, sort of came to the view that sense that there are different ways to skin this cat, you know, and some of those ways ought to be sort of put out there, led us to form this organization. So from that perspective, a very international perspective, the vulnerability that really scares us is that the United States system gives way too much control to political parties and partisan individuals over rulemaking and election administration. That's sort of the big umbrella. Relative to the way things work in other countries, we have parties in the driver's seat of the rules and the system. The example of that that's most familiar is called gerrymandering. That is political parties operating through a majority in a legislature, setting the boundaries of the district in which people will compete. That can help a party win the majority of seats when they don't have the majority of votes in the state, which has happened a whole lot of times, particularly recently. That can create the safe districts that I think Larry and Ned were both referencing as one of the reasons we have so little competition, you know, and why that primary winner with a low backing will necessarily very likely go into Congress. So redistricting is one example of, it's really a conflict of interest. The people running shouldn't be setting the districts that they run in. And so we as a country have kind of heroically started wrestling with that problem over the last couple of decades. I cite this poll that Pew did like 2004, I think it was, where they were kind of checking for familiarity with the word gerrymandering, and they got like 6% recognition of the word gerrymandering. Fast forward to 2018, and there are 5 states with like citizen-led, like heroic grassroots movements that have pushed through against all of the self-interested opposition of the people in the state legislatures, have pushed through these reforms to hand over the business of drawing those lines to independent commissions. So that's a win. We haven't won in enough states, but it's a win. We also need to replicate in the other areas where political parties and partisan people have too much control. The second area where they have too much control has already been touched on. It's the issue of secretaries of state and others who run elections who themselves have very close ties with political parties because they can't get the job without close ties to a political party. It is virtually impossible to win election as a secretary of state without being backed by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, without receiving funding from those two parties. So you go from, being a candidate backed by one side to allegedly judging both sides. And, to, I think, Ned's point about, we need to think about the morality of the people as well as the structures. We actually have been blessed with extraordinary morality. One of the things we've done is we've taken this study of all of the partisan acts of secretaries of state going back 20 years. There are some, Katherine Harris in Florida, for one. There are a few others, but it's nowhere near as bad as you might think, given that many of these individuals really wanted to, go on and run for Senate in their party. They were very much aligned with the ideology of their party, but they were able to put that hat aside and be neutral. The vulnerability we worry about is that is starting to fade, partly because zealots are signing up to be candidates, and partly just because the drivers of polarization are getting so intense that people with even the best intentions are starting to step across lines that you really shouldn't step across to be a neutral election official. And the one example I would give there is the Maricopa County recorder, Stephen, help me, you guys know who. Stephen Richer, who sort of Republican and kind of very nobly stood up to the kind of the fake audit that was going on in Arizona that I imagine many people have read. And he kind of got so mad at all of this that he said, to heck with it, I'm going to start a PAC and raise money to give to Republicans who aren't election deniers. If you went to any major democracy that the United States deals with, any of our peers, and you said, so we've got this guy who's in charge of elections in a city of about 1 million plus people, and he's raising money to give to some of the candidates, they would say, that's like from Mars. That is so beyond that is so wrong. But in our context of polarization, he sort of gets applauded as kind of being a hero. So we're reaching that point where our partisanship is allowing us to really double down on a system of people one-sided, one way or the other, being in these controlling positions. There's a lot of subsequent things to talk about that, but I'll stop there because otherwise I'll go on too far.
Well, and actually, I think what we're saying kind of goes back to what Larry was talking about, right? So you have the primary system, and it has just continued to further polarize all of these candidates. So I guess my question, and maybe Larry, you could start is, given this polarization, how can any of this change, right? So if you think that, how can the primary system be changed? Because the polarized political system benefits from it.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the people who are not participating, it's a great coalition if you keep them interested and engaged. And Kevin was referring to some of these, efforts to come up with nonpartisan redistricting commissions constructed in different ways. There's a variety of different reforms that are being talked about to try to leach out some of the partisanship. I think there's a will. I think we're searching for an effective way to do this. And I was raised by very practical people, so I'm going to make a practical solution. This is not going to, the judges of kind of the Olympics of reform may not give it high scores, but I think it's doable. We have super delegates in the Democratic Party. We have unpledged delegates in the Republican Party. They are seen in the deformed system of democracy we now have for nominations. They are seen as undemocratic. Not true. The super delegates and unpledged delegates reflect it. They are the party. They are the party officials, the elected officials. Their primary orientation is to winning the general election. And there's a lot of excellent, elegant democratic theory and empirical research and just practical sense that if you've got people in charge who are not thinking about electing someone whose agenda is pure and close to their heart, but rather people who are going to win the general election, you're going to have a different set of motivations. So that would be my primary suggestion, which is, one, we have to stand up and say primaries are undemocratic. It's a small number and they are not representative. Second, we have to look for ways in which we can do tweaks. There are tweaks. I'm not talking about revolution here, but meaningful tweaks of increasing the number and importance of superdelegates and unpledged delegates so that their voices are much more part of the mix. They're not going to be making a decision, but if you roll back to 2016, would some of the final set of challenges of Donald Trump hung around if they had a chance of winning over the delegates from the other candidates and there was a sufficient pool of unpledged delegates that they could have appealed to? Maybe. But that to me is the kind of practical move that we need to go down. The second thing I would say is, this is a big downer, this conversation. Folks who are watching are thinking, oh my God, it's all over. I don't subscribe to that view. I think we have real challenges and they're worrisome and we can't just go to bed at night and pretend like they don't exist. There are so many people who are committed to American democracy, who are in the front lines. Kevin was referring to the miraculous group in Maricopa County in Arizona and the way they handled that recount, which was a farce. And it really taught us that a relatively small number of people can have big impact. Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State who voted for Donald Trump, followed the law and followed the rules. And there are many, many people like that. In addition to the names we know, there are over 50,000 election officials who are at work and are not easily kind of kidnapped or brainwashed. I think one of the second thing we can be doing is putting a lot more attention into the training of nonpartisan professional election officials. Lots of countries have these, and they're the ones who do the redistricting and other sorts of processes. In America, we just pretend like they don't exist. They exist, they're very important, and they're a critical component of our representative system.
Yeah, and actually, Kevin, I was very interested in something that you wrote about how other democracies who also had elections during COVID dealt with it so much better than we did, partly because they did have people in these positions who were able to make the decisions, but were nonpartisan. And I think that comes to this, the issue is, how much of this is structural and how much of it is just, or even as you allude to, Larry, the individuals who are filling these positions and what they do.
I'd love to say just a point following up on Larry's comment and your comment, Pam, because I think that really gets at it. And the question of, can we put people who are nonpartisan in charge of elections? The dialogue about that in the US is often sort of kind of shouted out from the leadership, where you hear people say, there's no such thing as a nonpartisan. Everyone has a partisan side. They should just be overt about their partisan side. It'll never work. No other country sort of accepts that argument. I would say our founders would hate that argument. They would throw up all over that argument because their whole notion was we keep parties out of the system when we rely on virtuous people, which we could kind of call nonpartisan people, to do the best for the country, to put country over party. So if our leaders are saying the thing our founders wanted, nonpartisanship, is sort of undoable, we should kick them out. We can't have leaders that deny the viability of nonpartisanship. Imagine the approach to the military that says there's no such thing as a nonpartisan. We're going to have Democratic and Republican chief, generals of each branch because everything needs to be balanced. Like crazy. The other piece to what you were talking about, Pam, this difference between, for the US, we had to make changes to COVID. It led to 500 lawsuits. A handful of other countries we looked at that made the exact same changes to COVID, there was like 3 in each one, was that because they had nonpartisans in charge, the legislature didn't have to micromanage the rules. So we've done, for example, we did a very long study of Canada, and once they handed over, they made their election officials officially nonpartisan, so much so that they're not even allowed to vote. The equivalent of the Secretaries of State in each province and the head of Elections Canada are not allowed to vote. And there is a real faith that they are nonpartisan. And over time, in the 80 years since that system was established, the legislatures gave more and more authority to them. First saying, well, if there's an emergency, you guys can make decisions. Well, also, why you guys can make the decisions about what ID requirements are called. You guys can make the decisions if there has to be a postpone. You guys can make all the decisions. And that delegation to the professional was done by conservative and liberal parties in every province in Canada, because they knew it was better to get the party people who sit in the legislature out of setting up rules on the details of election and put the professionals in charge. Here in the US, we're like, well, the legislature has to decide whether there's a drop box every county or every 100 people. And no country would be deciding voting rules at that level of detail in a decision-making forum that's effectively very political, like a legislature.
I'm curious, and Ned, do you see that that would ever change, though, in this system, Ned?
Well, a couple points. One is I'm agreeing with Kevin. I would love that we were more of the nonpartisan election administration of the kind that he's talking about. So anything that we can move in that direction, I applaud. I do feel the need to say that unfortunately we have some constitutional constraints that allow us, that prevent us from being completely along those lines. So for example, we have an old-fashioned rule that gives each chamber of Congress the final authority to decide the winners of an election to either the Senate or the House. So you could have all the greatest nonpartisan election administration in state government. They give the certificate of election to the Senate or the House, and then partisanship could take over there and completely repudiate the result. And Kevin was kind enough to mention the Ballot Battles book that was my earlier book. And then unfortunately, there's some very ugly examples of either the Senate or the House, depending upon the year in the race, abusing that power for partisan reasons. So we need to pay some attention to the back end of the process. And a similar point is what I made earlier about the Electoral Account Act, and again, the role that the partisan Congress inevitably has to declare the winner of a presidential election. So yes, as much nonpartisanship as we can, but other reforms to constrain Congress's abuse of its own inevitably partisan role. Going back, Pam, to your question about how do we adopt kinds of reforms that might be a good idea, I think two things are really important to mention. It's not a magic wand, but some of these independent commissions that we've been talking about were adopted in so-called citizens initiatives or ballot measures that some states, many states, not all, have. So, one particular woman in Michigan said, gerrymandering is awful, we can't do it. And using, social media, she created a grassroots movement that led to Michigan's Independent Redistricting Commission, the new system that Alaska has that I alluded to. Whether you like the details or not, that was the product not of state legislation, but this kind of ballot initiative measure. So I think we should on a state-by-state basis, look at targets of opportunity there with the right kind of reform proposals tailored to particular states to achieve some of the objectives that Larry and Kevin and we're all talking about. But one thing that Congress could do, it's not an 800-page law, it's almost a one-sentence law. It's that simple, that there ought to be the political will for, at least sufficient political will, would be an act of Congress that said to win a seat in Congress in November, you need a majority, not merely a plurality of votes. Most Americans, I think, probably think that's the rule anyway. You shouldn't get to Congress without, reflecting the will of the majority. But in fact, that's not true. If Congress actually had that rule in the 19th century for Senate elections. Many people may not remember that prior to the 17th Amendment, I guess it was in the Progressive era, US senators were appointed by state legislatures, or technically elected, but the voters were just state legislatures. Well, it turned out that some state legislatures in fractured elections were sending US senators to Congress that didn't get a majority of the relevant vote in the state legislature. And Congress said, no, you don't deserve a seat in the US Senate unless you have majority support. So in 1866, they passed a statute that said to be a US Senator, you gotta win a majority of votes. It's a great idea. It fell by the wayside because it seemed obsolete once the 17th Amendment was adopted, but we need that kind of provision again. And it would have a catalytic effect of jumpstarting the kind of primary reform that Larry's talking about and other kind of reforms, because almost all the states in the union would be in non-compliance because, again, most states rely on this concept of a plurality. There was a question I saw in the Q&A on the Zoom that said, what about California's top two system? I'm not a huge fan of it, but it's better than what most states do. It would comply with the majority winner requirement. So if that's what a state like Ohio, my state, wanted to try, it could do that. Ohio could try Alaska. Ohio could try what Maine is doing, which is an interesting innovation that's different from Alaska. We need that kind of state-by-state experimentation. Congress could not micromanage the rules, but facilitate this exploration. Why do I think it's feasible? Because if members of the Republican Party want to save their own party from, the unfortunately extremist anti-democracy, element of it, you hear people like Mitch McConnell professing that they like to actually honor the results of elections, unlike some members of their party. And if the traditional Republican Party wants to not become extinct like dinosaurs, they would realize that this kind of majority winner rule would be the methodology that would allow the kinds of reforms that would give space for the center of American politics. This polarization that we've been talking about is partly a product of voter preferences, but it's especially a product of the improper magnification of those preferences, pushing us apart in ways that Larry and Kevin have talked about. A majority winner rule, for reasons we could explore, would bring us back more towards the center and give space for more traditional Republicans to compete.
So isn't what, and maybe Kevin, you could talk a little bit about this. Again, I hate to be too negative, but we do seem to be moving in the opposite direction. And maybe you can explain a little bit, about the whole potential vulnerability of the independent legislature doctrine, which could in fact give legislatures more power over this system and to make it even more polarized. Or am I wrong about that?
I'll take a crack at it, and the others join in because they may know it deeper than I do. But the Supreme Court has effectively asked for a case, and we'll hear a case that kind of takes up a theory called the independent state legislature theory, which says that when the Constitution references the states, the legislatures thereof, the legislatures of the states, as having the responsibility over the time, place, and manner of elections for the House and Senate, that means just the legislature. It doesn't mean the legislature operating in the context of the state constitution, whereby some decisions by the legislature might be overturned, say by the state judiciary on the ground that they were unconstitutional. And it also probably precludes other legislative functions like the referenda that Ned mentioned, where a ballot initiative introduces a new measure onto the Constitution, such as the establishment of one of these independent redistricting commissions that we've talked about. So if the Supreme Court rules kind of on a strict and very narrow interpretation accepting this theory, we may lose the opportunity to use the referendum to restrain legislatures and put in place somewhat independent bodies like these commissions. And we may lose the ability for state courts to say to legislatures, wait a minute, you're just passed a law that violates our constitution, our state constitution. So it's sort of turbocharging the entity that's arguably already too powerful in our system. That's how I see it. I'd really be interested in how Ned and Larry see that.
Larry or Ned, do you want to weigh in?
Well, I'm happy to say a few words. I think, Kevin, you captured it pretty well. I think, I do think you're correct that if the US Supreme Court adopts the kind of most extreme version of this theory, we're in uncharted waters. A couple of reasons why they may not go that far is Chief Justice Roberts, in his opinion for the court and explaining why the court was not going to adjudicate partisan gerrymandering claims, made a nod to the fact that the court previously had upheld the right of these independent redistricting commissions to exist, and that was an avenue of reform. Now, he may no longer be the pivotal vote on the court, and the court can do what the court does, but they would be retracting. They would not just be overruling the Arizona precedent that he was referring to, but they would be retracting the signal that this is a legitimate avenue of reform. So I guess I want to mention that. The other thing is, I think, this is a very complicated technical area of constitutional law, but there probably are intermediate steps that it can acknowledge that, yes, the text of the Constitution does say state legislatures have certain powers, and that there may be some judicial enforcement of that basic principle without disabling state constitutions for imposing reasonably clear and circumscribed constraints on the role of the legislature. To give you an example, most state constitutions in the last 100 years have said that voting has to be by secret ballot. We like the idea of a secret ballot. We didn't always have that in the country, and state constitutions have adopted that. They've adopted that for elections in a state that are not just for mayor of your town or governor of the state or state legislature, but for congressional elections. And I think there's a version of this doctrine where they say that when a constitution does that, it specifies a particular rule. It doesn't give carte blanche power to the judiciary to just rethink whatever the legislature does. Those kinds of specific constitutional provisions are allowed to constrain the otherwise operative rule of what a state legislature does. When Roberts wrote an opinion of his own in the Arizona case, he wanted to make clear that as long as the legislature wasn't completely disabled from participating in a power that the Constitution vested in it, there was room for state law to constrain the legislative power. I think what makes the justices, or the more conservative justices on the court, is the notion that a state Supreme Court could take a very vague provision that really has no content to it and replace whatever the state legislature wants with whatever the judiciary wants. I wouldn't necessarily welcome that ruling, but a ruling that's confined to that kind of theory doesn't necessarily take away the power of referendum to adopt, say, ranked choice voting, because that's like the secret ballot. We're not giving the judiciary the power to do whatever it wants. We're simply saying the way we do elections is ranked choice voting.
Well, maybe I could just jump in here to say, for folks who are trying to follow this, and particularly Ned's erudite discussion of the complexity, is a very simple take-home point here, which is that this idea of independent state legislative authority is to block courts from coming in and judging and overturning gerrymandering. It was being used by the Trump folks to try to overturn election results. And in 2020, there were actually 3 justices in response to one of the Trump filings that appeared to support it. So it's very much alive and kicking. And, I think we are going to see it. Whether there's, 2 more justices are going to sign on to this idea is something we don't know yet, but keep an eye out for this.
Yeah, and I was, because that's of course why we had these alternative slates of, fake
Exactly.
electors. And I guess, is there anything going on? I mean, I know that are discussions on the Hill about reforming the Electoral Account Act. Is there anything in that would prevent that from happening? Does anybody know?
Well, conceptually, yes. We'll have to see whether Congress adopts it. But this is a very important point that hasn't gotten sufficient attention in my judgment. With respect to the concept of alternative slates of electors, it's not sufficient to embrace even the most extreme version of this idea that Larry and Kevin are talking about. Why? Because even if you accept the proposition that state legislatures under Article 2 of the Constitution get to choose the manner of appointing electors, the Constitution does say, I'm not a fan of the Electoral College, I wish we didn't have it, but we do, and the Constitution does say, electors shall be appointed in the manner chosen by state legislatures. And the Supreme Court has said, at least in the first instance, state legislatures have to decide whether you're going to have a popular vote to choose electors that thankfully states have. Are you going to do the special method that Maine and Nebraska have adopted, which is to piggyback on the existence of congressional districts, which I don't think is a good idea for appointing electors because it bakes in gerrymandering to the presidential process, but it's unfortunately, within the Article 2 ambit. But the Constitution, the same Article 2 also says that Congress can choose the time at which electors are appointed. And Congress has exercised that choice by specifying what we all know to be Election Day, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And the relevant statute says that's the date on which electors are appointed. And so whatever the method a state legislature chooses, it chooses for that date. It cannot then, subsequent to that date in November, say, oops, we actually want a different method to appointing electors for this year. There are no takebacks. Congress sets the date, and the legislature is stuck with its own decision for that election. It can change the rules for the next presidential election 4 years down the road. So no state legislature, this is why some of what Eastman was trying to do was just predicated on complete, constitutional nonsense, but legislatures do not have the authority to say, we had a law for a popular vote, it got counted, it got adjudicated, and by the way, we don't like the result. That's not within the power of even the most ambitious version of this novel doctrine.
But just picking up on that, Ned, the state legislature, if I understand this correctly, could rule that the election failed and cite, the software was compromised, all the machines were compromised, or whatever conspiracy theory. And if it votes that the election failed under the current reading of the ECA, couldn't they then name their own electors?
Well, yes, that's an important point. Congress, given that Congress has this power to set the time of appointing electors, Congress does have in a provision that is called the failed election provision, which says that if a state has failed to appoint electors, it gets a second chance by whatever new method. I do think an essential component of ECA reform is to clarify that it doesn't count as a failed election, that the legislature simply doesn't like the result. As long as the ordinary procedures for conducting counts and recounts has achieved a result, there's no failures, but that should be clarified. That provision could even be eliminated, not even to give a state a second chance. So the point there is that if a legislature tried to do this, I think even under current law, it would be abuse and a stretch of that provision that you're referencing. But Congress has completely within its power to eliminate that abuse, and that should be a key component of the reform that Congress adopts.
So
I'm sorry, Larry.
James Madison, who of course played a central role in the writing of the Constitution, and then in helping to pass it by writing the Federalist Papers, or many of them, he argued famously that one of the main purposes of the scheme of representation is to ensure that the public voice is consonant with the interests of the country and the public good, and that's why you needed representatives, not the citizens themselves, because you could filter out those who were selfish, ignorant, or driven by avarice. And that's what we're dealing with here. We're really dealing with who's in power, because for all the arguments going on around these different arguments for bypassing the electors or creating new slates of electors and other parts of Eastman's theories, it completely ignores the fundamental normative assumptions of the Declaration of Independence and every elected government we've had in Washington since the founding of the Republic, which is that we are governed and that there's consent of those who are being governed. And this would overturn it. So I think the very fact that these arguments are getting the kind of attention they are, and there are 3 Supreme Court justices who appear positioned to at least seriously entertain them, is a sign that our scheme of representation that Madison tried to create is not working. We need to be excluding people who are not believers and kind of demonstrated followers of the law and the Constitution. And in my view, political parties have their limitations for sure, but a properly constituted political party that is oriented to winning the general election, perhaps by majorities, would have as part of its mission playing this filtering role in terms of nominees. And many of these people we're talking about tonight and their anti-democratic ideas would not be in the forefront of the public conversation.
So again, I'd like to get to, how do we get from here to there? I mean, I just honestly don't see where the motivation is for a lot of these reforms that you've been talking about, to be honest.
Well, I think we need to change the public. I mean, we spent, I regret having to say it, but I think we did not spend the year 2021 wisely in terms of how to think about the priorities of bolstering and our democracy and making it sound, avoiding these vulnerabilities going forward. Again, the list of things that are desirable is long, and there were pernicious things that were being done at the level of state legislatures that caught a lot of attention. But they also distracted us from the kind of structural issues that Larry and Kevin are talking about, and the clock is ticking. So there's been virtually no public conversation, unfortunately, of the kind that Larry's talking about how primaries are so antithetical to what we really want out of a representative democracy. We've had some discussion of gerrymandering, but it's largely been overtaken by discussion of drop boxes, which, I'm a fan of drop boxes, but that's not as fundamental to whether we're going to get self-government and government by the consent of the governed. And so I hope we don't look back and think we've lost our democracy because we missed the opportunity to repair it. I hope we use the lessons that we learned to rebuild the conversation that we need to have, because you have to have the conversation first before you can get the things adopted.
So Ned,
Sorry.
can I just jump in?
Yep.
I want to ask Ned a question, and Ned, this is your great opportunity to bring hope and light to tonight's conversation. What is the latest on efforts to reform the Electoral Account Act? There was some like sprinkling of optimism along the way. There was a bipartisan group in the Senate that was meeting, and every now and again there'd be kind of a flurry of hope. Can you bring us great news of success around the corner?
No, unfortunately, and I don't want to in any way say something that I can't represent, because I don't have any real inside information at all. I am aware that there is the partisan group that you're talking about. My knowledge of it is they're still working. I've heard some media reports that I have no independent confirmation of, that there's a partial deal or they're close to a deal. So I'm cautiously optimistic that on that piece of reform, they will cross the finish line. I mean, don't go to Las Vegas and bet your mortgage on it or whatever, but because this is a fraught subject, but the filibuster stands in the way, as we all know, whether we like the filibuster or not. But I do think that there's real reason to believe that there can be 60 votes to overcome the filibuster on Electoral Account Act reform. So I am optimistic on that piece. I just can't, give you the guarantee.
And you don't think there's 60 votes for it?
No, I do think. Yeah, no, I think there is. I mean, I think.
Okay, I got it.
I think if Collins and Manchin close the deal with their group, they will get there.
Let me. I would like to take some questions from the audience if we can, and there is a question here from, and also please, audience, those in the audience, if you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A. This one's from Robert Shapiro, and this goes to the reforming the Electoral Account Act. And he said, wouldn't Republicans want to reform the Electoral Account Act to thwart any obstruction by the Democrats this time with Kamala Harris in the VP position in the 2024 election? And I'm not sure what it says, the Democrats will be looking for voter disenfranchisement or worse by Republican state officials. But maybe somebody could talk a little bit about, wouldn't there be some incentive for the Republicans to also want to make sure that nobody could use it against them as well?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. We can spin out scenarios where the Democrats abuse power for partisan gain. I mean, again, the history of gerrymandering is useful on this topic. We only have to look at New York and Illinois and some other states this year to know that Democrats abuse power too. They may not be Trump in that level or kind of abuse, but you can imagine a situation in which a Democratic governor could exploit some vulnerabilities in the Electoral Account Act to subvert the rule of law result of what happened in a state where there happened to be a Democratic governor. I don't like the idea of any governor subverting the rule of law, but under the current ECA, that could happen on either side of the aisle.
Pam, I'd like to just follow up on that, just to kind of go from it to a broader perspective that gets at your question about, how do we get there from here? Like, what's the path and what are the ways reform is going to happen? And the interesting thing is that in addition to there being, the reasons for the motivations on both sides that Ned mentioned in Congress, there's similar sort of motivations that potentially appear among the electorate itself, and particularly around the notion of, people in power shouldn't self-deal. That is a strongly held conviction that you can get people to vote for on both sides. And in Michigan, when that proposition was put before the voters in the form of, let's create an independent commission to do redistricting, it won by 62%. And if you look, we looked at all of the counties that Trump won by 25% or more. across Michigan. And that ballot initiative got majority support across all of those counties. We had a group approach this from Missouri, wanting to incorporate some of the Secretary of State reform ideas that we package. And their pitch to us was, well, conflict of interest polls really well on both sides. They want to do a ballot initiative about ranked choice voting. They want to combine that with Secretary of State reform, because that will get the center and center right voters who want people who aren't cheating, who aren't self-dealing. So I think there are motivations that we can get at. This goes again to what Ned said a little bit about how we wasted a year, in a way, kind of emphasizing the things that are most divisive, rather than going to the structural things that we had opportunity to get mutual support around.
And I have another question, and maybe Larry, you can take this. And it kind of goes to the fact that we're also dealing in an atmosphere where there's so much disinformation, right? And there's so much distrust, and people, the public in general just doesn't, some of them just don't know what to believe, or they choose to believe things that are just not true. And that is driving so much of what's going on here. And so the question is, should there be stronger rules regarding voting disinformation by public office holders? I'm thinking mostly about the notion of voter fraud being the vehicle in many states to limit voting hours and how citizens can vote. So does anybody have any thoughts on that? Is there some way to kind of penalize people for basically lying about the election?
I think there's obviously ways you can penalize, and I think professional associations are one strategy. We're seeing, for instance, state and the DC bar penalizing lawyers who pursued clearly erroneous, made up cases to overturn the 2020 election. And I think Rudy Giuliani has blown up whatever remnants of a career he had, but there's others who are suffering. So that's one approach, is kind of professional sanction. I think another is, frankly, Pam, the work and profession you're in. I think journalism has a very important role to play, and I would put a particular emphasis on online journalism, and addressing concerns that voters have. And I think that ties in part with some of our election officials. I think there's been a timidity among election officials to do the job, that they're hired to do, they're very well trained to do, and not be in public. And, there are a lot of good reasons for it. They don't want to be, and they shouldn't be part of the partisan action, and they don't want to become a target, and all that is, understandable. But when you've got folks who are just lying about, boxes of ballots showing up in the middle of the night, it's very important for voters to understand the chain of custody over ballots. They need to understand things like post-election audits and other steps that election officials go through. The rigor of our election process, in a lot of ways is impressive, but it's also invisible to a lot of voters. So I think there's an increasing kind of ethic of public communications that is falling on election officials to be part of the conversation and not back away, as understandable as that is.
Right. I mean, because you definitely had this, there was always this sentiment among election officials that if they stayed under the radar and they didn't get any attention, that meant the election was going well. And so there was a very big reluctance to get out there. But as I think was Kevin mentioned, especially Maricopa County was so under attack that they in fact became incredibly aggressive in countering the disinformation. And I think it's probably been a model for
I think Maricopa County is a model. I think our friends in North Carolina, who have really demonstrated some really innovative techniques, including things that, my students do all the time with TikTok and other sorts of social media. We need that kind of 21st century communication among election officials to get facts into the conversation.
So we have another question here from Eve Jacobs Carnahan, and she asks, and Kevin, this might go for you. She said, are there any models of reform we can find in another country that we can adopt within the constraints of the US Constitution? I know you've talked a little bit about some, but are there other types of reforms that you see, that maybe we could learn something from other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the independent redistricting model is one that's pretty ubiquitous in other democracies. So that's one. And that's something that, barring any kind of limitation that comes about through this independent state legislature theory that we talked about, barring any constraints there, that's something that's certainly consistent with the Constitution. It also could be something established by Congress. Congress would have the right to say that, at least for federal elections, that the boundary drawing would have to be done in that way. I also think, to go back to what Larry raised in the beginning and talking about sort of our election rules and how we think about, the process of aggregating the numbers into who wins, and the vulnerability which Ned touched on, the vulnerability of, not having majority winners. Some of the solutions that are beginning to percolate up here are working well in other countries. Things like ranked choice voting is in place. Australia, for example, has been using ranked choice voting for a long time, and voters report being pretty happy with it, and they can understand how it works, and it generally helps the election process result on a winner who is more broadly supported, almost always supported by the majority. And so there definitely are. So those would be some that I would mention, in addition to the one I talked about before about the equivalent of our Secretaries of State having to be nonpartisan and structuring that there are a bunch of different ways that could be structured. But so those would be several.
I have one question. I'm just curious what you guys think. Say Trump was completely out of the picture, even as a prospect for 2024, or this desire that so many Republicans who are running for office want to have his endorsement, feeling that he that is crucial for winning. Do you think if he was out of it, would a lot of these problems kind of correct themselves, or are we just so far beyond that they've taken on a life of their own, or there's something else going on? I'm curious.
Good question.
Me too. I think that is a key question. I guess we won't know until he leaves the stage one way or the other. I think you can tell both stories. I think you could say we're in a uniquely difficult moment because of his unique. I sometimes use the phrase electoral McCarthyism, because I think he's adopted a kind of mass pathology of paranoia that gripped us during the Red Scare with Joe McCarthy. A demagogue who has a following for whatever charismatic reason, and a huge percentage of the public is gripped by non-reality. There weren't those communists in the State Department that McCarthy talked about, but he convinced a lot of people that there were, and Eisenhower and others didn't, even though they were the same party, didn't cross him. Again, my reading of history is we've never had the combination of what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style of American politics, of which McCarthyism was a prime example of that era. That's never been combined with the vote counting process. And when we go back to the Declaration of Independence and the idea of self-government, and you cannot have this pathology that Hofstadter wrote about apply to the fundamental act of casting and counting votes. So I'm hoping that it's just unique to him as a demagogue that he leaves. But the other story, and I'll be quiet, is that it's cultural, it's deeper. He's just the symptom of the larger problem. He's not the problem itself. I think we need cultural sociologists to answer that question.
I certainly agree with Ned. I think we're in a moment when there is a grievance-driven politics around our populism. And, but that can come in a lot of different forms. We've seen, the racial form, we've seen anti-immigrant form, we've seen, Ed was mentioning the, anti-communist form, and there are others. Going after the electoral process is something different. I think, I listened to Mitch McConnell and I've done a bunch of conversations with some of the senior Republican consultants. They don't see a win in this strategy. They see the attack on elections as alienating the kind of better educated suburban voter that Republicans need. And there are plenty of options. DeSantis is not going to run on, or it doesn't appear to be oriented to, the same kind of anti-election or election denying that Trump did. I think we're going to see, kind of the post-Trump Trumpists, and they'll have their own sort of populism, but not this one. I don't see this as a winning strategy for Republicans. And let's face it, they're going to be winning a lot of elections in 2022 and possibly in 2024. Their interests are to support this system. And if Ned's right about his confidence in passing the reforms of the Electoral Account Act, then it'll be solidified.
Another sort of perspective to throw into this mix. I mean, it's a great question, Pam, and it's really interesting to hear those two comments. And if you look at the famous postmortem of the Republican Party in 2012, after they lost to Barack Obama for the second
big
time,
umbrella.
and they sort of the logical thing to do from a big D, not big D, but a sort of conceptual democratic perspective was broaden the umbrella. Broaden their base, reach out, build a party and a platform that could appeal more broadly. And then the smartest guys in the room in the back said, nope, that's not going to work. What's going to work is doubling down on the narrowest, most motivated. And the reason is structural. It's because of that, blank damned electoral college and the way in which that allows victory, a path to victory through, winner take all victory in certain states and how the demographics of those states. And so, Trump took everything to extreme, but the structural ingredients for elections to skew very far from what the country wants, what the majority wants, are present and exploitable.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I was hoping that we could leave our audience with something upbeat. So I know, Larry, you talked a little bit about how you have a hope because of election officials, but maybe, I don't know if you want to add something else. If each of you can think of something sort of positive that you, or that you're encouraged by and that you think may improve the system the way it is.
I think fundamentally, there's a culture in America about fairness in elections. And this is not Pollyannish, but, we all kind of grow up learning the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and, there ought to be more civics, so that's further ingrained. But there's some basic democratic values that we have. And what Donald Trump and the election deniers are doing are clearly going against the grain. Second point is that the electorate we have is not going to be the electorate we're going to have tomorrow. And it's true what Kevin said about, this effort to kind of, with the Republican Party, to think about what the future is and to reach out to women, voters of color. And the Trump solution was, no, we don't have to do that. We just have to use intensity to get a higher turnout of our existing voters. That is a short-term strategy. That is only going to work for a short while longer. And we can see, even with Donald Trump in 2020, his efforts to win, and with some success, voters of Hispanic origin was quite, had some success. So I think the fact that the electorate is changing is going to put more of an emphasis on building majorities, new majorities. And that coincides, I think, with our orientation to fair elections that I take to be a a kind of fundamental assumption of Americans.
Okay, that makes me feel good. Thank you. Ned?
I'd point to the progressive era as another period of American history where on multiple fronts, we really at least attempted and implemented changes to the electoral system. Some of them may have turned out not to be as desirable as we might have wanted, like the direct primary, but at least it was done. And there are reasons to think that unfortunately our current era resembles the period of time prior to that progressive era. That was called the Gilded Age, with disparities of wealth and polarization and ugliness of politics. And so if we are living in the unfortunate neo-Gilded Age, there's reasons to hope that it will be followed by a neo-progressive era that we have to put together with our new sets of reforms. So that's what I would point to for optimism.
That's great.
And I would echo that piece with one particular emphasis, which is in some ways the key achievement of the progressive reforms was that 17th Amendment you mentioned, which gave to the people the election of the Senate. And that took us really a major step further into realizing kind of the democratic culture and set of beliefs that Larry mentioned. But you think about that amendment, it got passed by states who were giving away power because they recognized that there was a broader benefit to come from that. And we need a bit of that. We need people who have their hands on the steering wheel to sort of realize, political parties in particular, to recognize the value to the whole system of stepping back. And I think you're right, Ned, if we do have a neo-progressive era, then it'll be guided by that sort of enlightened selflessness. And that's the thing that we should look for and encourage.
Well, that's great. And I'm very encouraged actually that so many people are talking about these issues, at least,
Right.
and hopefully we'll come up with some solution, and that the public really seems to care quite a bit.
And people are trying.
Right,
I mean,
right.
we've all
right.
been talking about different efforts around the country. I don't see Americans asleep at the wheel.
Right.
Not
right.
at all. Not at all.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. It's been a great discussion, and we only hit actually on a few of the vulnerabilities, but that was more than enough, I guess. And I just wanted to turn this over to Lee. And again, thank you so much. And thank you to
Thank
our
you, Pam.
audience.
Thank you very much, Pam.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, I just want to mention that one question came in right at the end there, which says, during the last century, media have changed enormously. Election campaigns need much money from media, TV ads. How has this changed, modified political norms? That topic of the flood of money into politics is an important one. It's one that we didn't really cover tonight, but it's one that we, I think at NFRPP will talk about maybe focusing on in a future session. So speaking of future sessions, just like to, first of all, thank the panel, Ned, Larry, Kevin, and Pam very much for guiding us through the conversation. We're going to have our next session on July 21st, at which time we'll be discussing the economy with a focus on inflation. I know Pam tried to end this this session on an up note, and now I'm telling you we're going to talk about inflation, which I think unfortunately will still be a relevant topic even a month from now. So that's sorry to end on that note. But at any rate, thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.